Next up is Sara Webb and Matthew Frizzell. I'll introduce them. Matthew Frizzell is serving as Dean of Community of Christ Seminary at Graceland University, and he is faculty in the Religion and Philosophy program on the Lamoni campus, so here on campus. Matt is the father of 2 daughters, Katie and Kensley. His wife Margot teaches in the Glazer School of Education at Graceland. Matt is a minister scholar who has served in full-time ministry for over 12 years in the Community of Christ. His academic training is in theology, sociology, and ethics. His academic interests are in Christian social ethics, theology, and economy, critical social theory, liberation theologies, and the so-called modern-postmodern divide. He received his PhD in theology and ethics from Chicago Theological Seminary, a master's in theological studies from St. Paul's School of Theology, and is a Graceland University alumnus. And Sara Webb has worked with the faith community on the issue of climate change as program and outreach coordinator for Iowa Interfaith Power and Light since 2007. She created Cool Congregations, a program to help religious communities reduce their carbon footprint as an act of faith, which she brought to over 400 congregations in 7 years in Iowa and 15 other states. It is now a program of the National Interfaith Power and Light organization. Among other programs she developed for Iowa IPL is Food, Faith, Climate, Connecting the Dots, and providing education on how our food practices contribute to climate change and exploring how our faith calls us to respond with practical solutions. Thank you very much for being here today. Let's welcome them to the stage.
Thanks so much, Jen, for inviting me to be here, and for all of you for coming inside on this beautiful day to be part of this. How do I work this thing?
To the right.
This button right here at the top, advances it?
Yeah, I know.
That's one side.
That's the arrow. Is to take forward. Push to the side.
Okay.
The other side to go back. The other side.
Okay, great. Thank you. I love technology. Yes, I'm with Iowa Interfaith Power and Light. Our mission is to work with the faith community on the issue of climate change. Okay? So I'm here to answer the question, why do people of faith care about climate change? Why is this a particular concern to people of faith? Well, all the major faith traditions of the world call their believers to care for the poor and for the earth. So I just wanted to look at a sampling of a couple of scriptural references to begin. God saw everything that God had made, and indeed it was very good, from Genesis. See my works, how fine and excellent they are. All that I created for you. Reflect on this, and do not corrupt or desolate my world, for if you do, there will be no one to repair it after you. That's from the Jewish tradition. Do no mischief on the earth, after it hath been set in order. That's from the Quran. And here's a few from the Pope's recent encyclical, Caring for Our Common Home. Human-induced climate change is a scientific reality, and its decisive mitigation is a moral and religious imperative for humanity. Or this one. The climate is a common good, belonging to all and meant for all. And he offers us hope. Humanity still has the ability to work together to build our common home. As people of faith, it is our moral responsibility to do what we can to reduce the pollution that causes climate change for the sake of the poor who are hurt first and worst, and for future generations who will have to deal with what comes after. This is another reason that people of faith care about climate change, because climate change is a threat multiplier. People of faith spend their lives taking care of the vulnerable in our society through our relief work, and climate change is making it much harder. We care for the sick and the poor who are located near coal-fired power plants. And it's the poor who suffer the worst from the effects of this pollution, for instance, with asthma and heart conditions. We care for the hungry. This Chinese farmer and his family are among many around the world who are suffering hunger as a result of the changing precipitation patterns that are due to climate change. And we care for the displaced, the refugees. In the coming years, there are going to be millions of people who are forced to relocate due to the effects of climate change. It's already happening. It's already happening. And these are the people who don't have the resources that we do here in the United States to pick up and move. And there's another thing. Climate refugees like these are not offered the same resources that political refugees are offered by international law. And the UN reports that human trafficking incidents go up 20 to 30% during environmental disasters. These are all issues that people of faith care about, and they are all becoming worse because of climate change. Another reason that people of faith care to do something about climate change, we have the moral imperative to protect and safeguard society's most vulnerable. And climate change is going to hurt the poor first and worst, so we are called to act. And people of faith are already making an impact. For the first time, our government, our federal government, has issued rules on limiting carbon emissions from our power sector. And my organization, Interfaith Power and Light, went to Washington, D.C., along with other faith organization representatives, representing millions of people of faith. And they presented comments in support of these rules to EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy. And then my organization followed up with 78,000 postcards and letters to Congress supporting these rules. Oops. There we go. Oh, and yes, last year, you heard about the People's Climate March? There were 10,000 people of faith in that march last year. As a result, there are many faith organizations planning activity such as this in their own states going forward. Oh, I like this story about Nebraska. Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light was influential in helping the third largest public utility in Nebraska to adopt a 48% renewable energy goal for 2016, which is the highest goal for any utility in the nation. And the Nebraska Utility Commissioner said that church people showing up at these public hearings was pivotal and pushed them to do more to advance renewable energy in Nebraska. That's just one of many stories from around the nation of church people getting involved and making a difference. And many congregations feel that it's immoral to burn fossil fuels. And so they're asking their nationwide denominations to divest from the investments in fossil fuel companies. And many already have, and the UCC Church was the first to do it. And many people of faith are also doing this. They're signing the Paris Pledge. This is a pledge to reduce, individuals and congregations are signing this pledge to reduce our carbon emissions by 50% by the year 2030 and to go entirely carbon neutral by the year 2050 as a means of encouraging and calling on our world leaders when they go to Paris in December to work out the next international climate treaty, encouraging them to take the same deep cuts, the commitments to deep cuts. And you can sign it yourself. Go to parispledge.org, or you can take one of these cards that's on my chair next to Leon today, take it with you and sign that, and mail them into us. That would be great. And one of the ways that Interfaith Power and Light, my organization, is helping people to sign the Paris Pledge is through the Cool Congregations program. It's a practical, hands-on program that shows you how to reduce your carbon emissions as an act of faith. It's kind of like making a tithe to the earth. And so congregations, Yes, Jen already said how many around Iowa and the nation are already engaged in doing this program. And I would invite you to come to my session this afternoon at 2 o'clock to learn more about it, and also how you can save energy in your home. Whether you're a person of faith or belong to a congregation, doesn't matter. Please come, and you will leave, hopefully, with the pledge yourself to reduce your carbon emissions at home. And you can learn more on our website, iowaipl.org. And I wanted to give you some examples of some graduates of the Cool Congregations program. This is the Mood Hearts home in Dubuque, Iowa. Inspired by their Catholic social teaching, 7 years ago, they installed geothermal to heat and cool their home, which then made their home an all-electric home, right? And so they reached payback 3 years ahead of schedule, and so they made the next investment by putting these solar panels on just 2 weeks ago. And these solar panels are sized to meet the entire electric demand of their home. And so now they have a carbon-free home.
Wow.
Isn't that cool? And it's very doable. There are tax incentives, tax rebates, whatever, through the federal government that can help you achieve this yourself. And here's First Lutheran up in Decorah, Iowa. We've been working with them for 7 years. They cut their energy use by 42% by installing a new boiler system, highly efficient boiler system, and what's that called? Heating and cooling by zones throughout, computer controlled throughout their building. And they weatherized their building, and they insulated it, and they put in new windows and doors. That's how they achieved their 42% reduction. Oh, and they changed some lighting over too. And just this year they installed solar. It's only been in for 5 months. Already they've cut their electricity use by 34%. So First Lutheran has also signed the Paris Pledge. They're well on their way to achieving it. So if all of you belong to a congregation, I encourage you to ask them to sign the Paris Pledge as well. So as people of faith, we are called to hope. We are not people that can succumb to despair in the face of the huge issue of climate change. We are called to hope. That's who we are. Working together by reducing our carbon emissions at home and in our congregations and in our communities, like the examples you just saw today, and advocating for sustainable energy policies at all levels of government, we can solve the issue of climate change. Let's do it for the poor, who we are called to care for, and for our children and our grandchildren, and all who come after us. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, and thank you to Sara for the work that she does. In many ways, her contribution here this morning is so much more important than what I'm about to share with you, because in the end, environmental stewardship is a question of action. I want to take you on a tour of theological ideas because that's my bag. And actually, the theological ideas that I'm going to introduce to you are the ones that already affect your life. If you are a student of environmental study or environmental stewardship, and you went to a seminary or you studied this from a religious perspective, I want to take you from through a 20,000 foot view of the kind of things that you would encounter. Lynn White. Lynn White was a medieval scholar from the 20th century. And if you studied environmental theology or the environmental crisis or ecological crisis from a theological perspective, you would eventually have to run into Lynn White. And you would read his article published in 1967 in the Journal of Science called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. 1967. Lynn White recognized that the roots of our ecological crisis and our struggle to grasp our relationship to the earth has its roots in the Christian tradition, and particularly Christianity's understanding of humanity's relationship to nature. And I would like to introduce you or show you a paragraph from that article. Our science and technology have grown out of Christian attitudes towards human relationship to nature. Despite Darwin, we are not in our hearts part of the natural process. We see ourselves superior to nature, contemptuous of it, willing to use it for our slightest whim. What we do about ecology depends on our ideas of the human-nature relationship. More science and more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecological crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. Some of you, if you were in a different tradition, you'd be saying amen, because I'm watching you kind of nod. We could quibble about several aspects of this quote. We could talk about whether science and technology are actually going to save us, or we could argue many aspects. But the central question is critically important. What is humanity's relationship to nature? As a species, we're intersecting with where Leon left us. What is our relationship to the earth? Darwin argued from a scientific perspective, if you follow evolutionary ways of thinking, that human beings are a part of the natural process. We are a point in the evolutionary movement of nature. Christianity, though, in its tradition, holds a different view, that humanity is somehow superior, made in God's image, and therefore has dominion over creation. And this thread has seemed to be incredibly influential on Western law, politics, and economics. Many of you may recognize this neighboring verse to the one that Sara showed us. This is Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over the wild animals of the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." Dominion. Some of you may be thinking and doing theology already, well, if we're made in God's image, and being made in God's image means having dominion, and if dominion leads to dominating the earth like we have now, perhaps we should rethink our image of God. That's a whole other theological conversation. Instead, I'd rather focus on this image of our relationship to nature. Do we have dominion over nature? What does it mean to be made in the image of God? What does it mean to have dominion? It is not a large jump, and in terms of the history of ideas, the theology of dominion and what it means to have dominion is a close relative to some of the most basic ideas of Western culture, Western political economics, and even law. You can recognize this idea of dominion in some reflection in terms of our very concept of ownership or right to property. The reason why I am going to talk about this just briefly is because it has everything to do with stewardship. John Locke believed that if I go into nature and I grab one of these sticks and I whittle it, the added labor that I put to this stick to make a marshmallow stick, to make a beautiful roasted marshmallow, that stick becomes mine because my labor was added to it. The same thing would be true if I went out into the woods and cut a tree to build my own home. The labor to cut down the tree and to build my house would make the property mine, proper to me. My added labor to it would make it my own. This concept goes to the heart of the Western understanding of the right to property and the right of ownership. The right of property and the right of ownership has to do with my legal right to hold, trade, and dispose of, according to my want and need, a thing, a piece of nature, an element of creation. And yet, what is so radical about stewardship is stewardship implies something almost completely different. You may recall from medieval times that if you were the steward of the king's property, you didn't own any of it at all. The concept of stewardship in many ways is a critique. It runs counter to the idea of private property or ownership, because if you are a steward of something, you take care of something that belongs to someone else. This too runs deep in the Christian tradition. Because according to the creation story, if we do what Lynn White asked us to do and go back and reread the creation account and the doctrine of creation, we can come up with a concept of property that's very different from dominion. Ultimately, from a Christian theology perspective, stewardship suggests that all of creation, nature, belongs to God. And so as stewards, we care for what is ultimately God's. And in God's stead, to take the next jump forward in our thinking, on behalf of God, made in God's image, having dominion, all of nature and creation actually belongs to the whole species because it is put in our care. So as a steward, you are responsible for the earth and you're responsible for creation as someone who takes care of something that ultimately belongs to someone else. And the first stance theologically, and because we're theologians and we care about this, it belongs, the earth, nature, belongs to God. But perhaps even if you are not a theological thinker, property belongs to the human species. My care for the earth is caring for an earth that belongs to you, but also is extended to those who are to come. So how do we take this idea of dominion and humble it? How do we take this idea of humanity in its relationship to nature and give it a little humility? Humble, humility, human, Latin, root word humus, literally means earth. How do we put the earth back in to our understanding of humanity's relationship to nature? This was part of Lynn White's question, and so he asked, possibly we should ponder the greatest radical in Christian history since Christ, St. Francis of Assisi. The key to an understanding of Francis in his belief in the virtue of humility, not merely of the individual, but of man, of humanity. I will correct Lynn White in 1967. As a species. It's no wonder that this man named himself after St. Francis of Assisi. Some of you are giving me that amen, nodding your heads. It's no wonder that Pope Francis, in his encyclical already noted this morning, Laudate Si, names himself after Pope Francis, after St. Francis as Pope Francis I, and makes the same argument that Lynn White made 48 years earlier. I believe that St. Francis is the example par excellence of care for the vulnerable and of an integral ecology lived out joyfully and authentically. He is the patron saint of all who study and work in the area of ecology. He was particularly concerned for God's creation and for the poor and outcast. He loved and was deeply loved for his joy, his generous self-giving, his open-heartedness. He was a mystic and a pilgrim who lived in simplicity and in wonderful harmony with God, with others, with nature, and with himself. He shows us how inseparable the bond between concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. I invite you to read the encyclical that was published by the Vatican on behalf of Pope Francis. He, according to Christian tradition, as a voice of the Christian in today's world, argues that within our faith resources themselves, there are resources to reimagine our relationship not only to the earth, but to each other. Through humility, we see ourselves as a part of nature, as a species. And as a species, we see ourselves as deeply related to one another. That's the message of our stewardship.